Hello and welcome to H2View webinars as we continue to explore the role of hydrogen in a post-COVID world and the scale-up and investment required to realise that. I'm your host, Rob Cockerell, and in part 2 of this series we focus on scale-up and 3 areas of technology in particular: fuel cells, electrolyzers and compression. Joining me today to bring that discussion, debate and insight direct to you are David Hart of E4 Tech, Randy McEwen of Ballard Power Systems, and Jim Petrecki of PDC Machines. Last week, we talked a great deal about the growing importance of hydrogen in the clean energies transition and how there had never been such momentum behind it. We talked about the growing zest for hydrogen, about the mechanisms for facilitating its uptake, and we learned much more detail about the EU hydrogen strategy, all of which will be key to realising hydrogen's future role over the next decade. That's a decade that was described earlier this year as the decade of the fuel cell by E4 Tech's David Hart. And David is with us now to explain why and tell us what's required for that to happen. Over to you, David.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Rob. And yes, I mean, it's very exciting times and obviously very strange times. And when I wrote that article, that was pre-COVID, and there have been some implications inevitably from that. But they are both positive and negative, and I wanted to touch on those a little bit in what I'm going to say for the next few minutes. So the first thing is to say that last year was a bit of a breakthrough year because it was over a gigawatt of fuel cells that was shipped. And that's an important milestone. It's an important psychological milestone, but it's also very important because it means that the supply chain is starting to get into place. It means that scale is coming. It means that cost is coming down. And those are figures that we gather annually for our fuel cell industry review, which, and apologies for the short plug, free report, end of every year, tells you a little bit about what's going on in the industry, but also explains who's been shipping what. And last year it was mostly cars. Of those 1.1 gigawatts, 700 megawatts were actually cars. Seems strange to measure power in terms of vehicles, but actually it's really important because power is what drives the cost of the fuel cell industry. It's an electrochemical device, so it's all about surface area. It's all about understanding how you can make more of that cheaper with larger scale processes. And that was driven largely by Hyundai, by Toyota, and of course by other participants such as Ballard, which we have here, feeding into all sorts of areas which are other vehicles. So cars are very important. They have been a sort of a loss leader almost for the industry in the previous years. But what we see now is we see that starting to turn into something which is economically much more viable. And that's why we think that this decade is going to be particularly exciting. So there were also stationary shipments. Japan has had 300,000 fuel cells put into apartments over the last number of years. It's a real industry. It's something that's economically efficient, and it's something that also reduces CO2 and improves air quality. And those are key points that I'm going to come back to in a second. So what's happened since the turn of the year, since I wrote that article? Well, one thing's pretty obvious. We've had a hiccup in the global economy, which we're going to call COVID. Having said that, there is an enormous amount of positive momentum that has come out of that in terms of, for example, the EU hydrogen strategy, which is linked to the green recovery strategy, the Green Deal that we've also heard a lot about. And those sort of opportunities are starting to become more and more apparent as we look not only at the political landscape, but also at the investment landscape. So we're getting a lot of inquiries from not only venture capitalists looking at investing in fuel cells, which is something that hasn't happened for a long time, but also from investment banks, from people who run the ESG teams, the sustainability corporate governance teams within very large investors. And they're saying, well, we're going to need something that comes out of this, which is climate friendly, which also hits the bottom line, which helps on a social basis as well. And fuel cells tick all of those boxes. So there's a big picture which fuel cells fit beautifully into at the moment, and that's partly because of hydrogen as a driver, but it's partly also about developing jobs, developing competitive industries, developing the next big green thing. At the same time, companies have realized that batteries don't do it all. Batteries are great. We're seeing a lot of electric vehicles come in, pure electric vehicles. Obviously, Tesla, Volkswagen's recent announcements about their smaller scale vehicles. But if you want to go heavy duty, and I'm sure Randy will be talking about this, you really need fuel cells and hydrogen. It's very hard to run a big truck, a 40-ton, 44-ton truck on batteries alone. You need something like 8 tons of batteries. And if you're looking at charging that in less than a day, you need megawatts and megawatts of charge capacity. So what we're seeing is partnerships between Daimler and Volvo. We've seen Cummins buy Hydrogenics. We have Weichai in partnership with both Ballard and with Ceres Power and an investor, Michelin and Faurecia. All of these people are putting their cards on the table to say, hey, we understand batteries. We have a battery division as well, but we think fuel cells are the way to go. And it's been very clearly laid out in a number of these strategies as well. So the European strategy, the Korean strategy, the Japanese strategy all talk about heavy duty. We mustn't forget there's momentum in even heavier duty. So rail, we're seeing deployed increasingly, announcements coming thick and fast. And we're also seeing announcements in shipping. So initially in smaller scale vessels such as ferries, but there's also interest in how you meet the IMO regulations for decarbonization of shipping to 2050. And some of that will be internal combustion engines running on things like ammonia, hydrogen, other fuels. Some of it may well be provided by fuel cells, particularly the hotel loads. And that's going to provide additional momentum. And on the stationary side, how do you build out the digital economy? All of us are doing this by video. That requires server centers, server farms all over the place. There's an enormous amount of power that goes into that. Microsoft and others are looking very hard at putting fuel cells into their data centers. That's another big driver. That's for stationary fuel cells. So all of that leads us to believe that we're really on the early part of a very impressive hockey stick. And the other thing I just want to close with is all of this means the supply chain is getting stronger. So the companies I mentioned earlier, a lot of those are tier one automotive companies. They know how to build supply chains. They know how to bring costs down. They know how to reach customers. They know how to do service and support. And that's a very, very promising sign for the industry, because as those companies engage and costs come down, different applications become competitive. And as each application becomes competitive, you'll see a reinforcement of enthusiasm within the general public. They'll say, oh yeah, fuel cells are a good thing. They're interesting. We want more fuel cells. You'll see it within the investor community. It says, yes, we can probably make some money out of this. And you'll see it in the politicians who say, well, okay, I stuck my neck out a bit with a fuel cell and hydrogen strategy. That's starting to pay back. I'm starting to see some jobs, and I'm starting to see some economic development as well as air quality benefits. So all of these things lead me to think that really we're in a very, very good position going forward, COVID or no COVID. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David. Clearly a lot of factors converge in there in this kind of decade. Could you tell us a bit about the electrolyzer side of the market? I mean, that's going to be a fundamental technology in this value chain, isn't it, towards where we're heading?
Electrolyzers are very, very important. And to be honest, we've seen even more excitement in the electrolyzer industry than in fuel cells. So it's historically a very small industry, the water electrolysis industry at least, relatively small number of companies building electrolyzers on a project by project basis. But in the last 18 months, and particularly in the last 6 months, we've seen this enormous wave of enthusiasm, particularly for green hydrogen. And green hydrogen means renewable electricity, and it means electrolysis. There are a few other pathways, but that's the bulk of where things are coming from. And we've seen announcements like 6 gigawatts of electrolysis, or estimations that we want to go to 30 or more gigawatts of electrolysis by the end of the decade. And that's a huge step up for an industry that's currently at a few hundred megawatts, to be completely honest, on an annual basis. So the good thing is that we're already seeing them starting to step up. So we've seen announcements from Nel, a Norwegian supplier, that they're moving to scale up their factory, 300 megawatts, eventually to a gigawatt. ITM Power in the UK also aiming at a gigawatt. ThyssenKrupp, a well-established large industrial player already has a gigawatt capability. And so, again, that supply chain is starting to move. And as the supply chain moves, the costs come down. And the costs can be very, very interesting because historically it's been an industrial chemical. There's been a very high value to the hydrogen that's been produced. There hasn't been the emphasis on cost reduction that there is today. But the headroom in the electrolyzer industry is substantial. And we've seen costs, announced costs at least, moving from $2,000 a kilowatt to $1,500 to $1,000. And we're seeing people talking about mid thousands, so 500 roughly dollars a kilowatt in the near term, and even lower in the longer term. And that means you can be competitive in areas where you have a substantial amount of renewables. So if you're running your electrolyzer for, say, 80% of the time, actually it's not the capital cost that's important, it's the cost of the renewable energy that goes into it. And all of the projections suggest that you can start to become competitive with renewable hydrogen produced at large scale once you get into sort of 60, 70, 80% utilization. So it's a really exciting time. What we're seeing is people building projects, so 20, 30, 50 megawatt projects being announced. Very large announcement also in Saudi Arabia, where NEOM is looking to build green ammonia production, and that will have a significant impact on the supply chain. But once we have these projects up and running, proof points, as it were, I think that it's going to be, again, it'll work in synergy with the fuel cell industry, because once you have hydrogen, you can start to deploy fuel cells in a way that people are not necessarily thinking about, or perhaps are not thinking are going to be economic. But if you have some extra capacity, for example, around an ammonia plant, maybe you can run some buses, maybe you can run some heavy duty vehicles, forklifts, maybe you can start doing other things. So there's a very interesting clustering effect, which I think we're going to see, and a sort of rippling out from the stones that are dropping into the ocean, as it were, in the near term.
That's great. Thanks, David. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to you with some more questions later. Now, one company certainly doing its bit to stimulate and scale up fuel cell systems, particularly in the mobility market, is Ballard Power Systems. Ballard has widely been regarded as the gold standard in fuel cell technology leadership and performance for many years. The company continues to be at the forefront of developments in this space, and our next guest, Ballard President and CEO Randy McEwen, described last year the clear signals that the hydrogen and fuel cell industry is at an exciting stage in its evolution. Welcome, Randy. Thanks for joining us today. Could you tell us a bit more about this evolution, about the scale up in fuel cell systems and mobility markets, and crucially, what's needed ahead?
Yeah, clearly. Thanks for having me. And it was exciting a year ago, and it's only gotten more exciting since then, and probably really couldn't have forecasted the type of momentum we're seeing. But I think there are 5 key trends that are important to understand, 5 key developments over the last year that have gotten us to this point. The first is policy, and we've seen obviously a lot of policy support in the EU with Green Deal, green hydrogen, green recovery. Last year, I think underreported were the changes to the heaviest trucks in terms of emission standards, with a 15% reduction emission requirement by 2025 and a 30% reduction requirement by 2030. And we'll likely see that extended to buses in the 2022 timeframe. And then you go to California, just recently we had CARB announcing clean truck standards, where we're looking at a certain portion of trucks required to be zero emissions starting in 2024. And they, depending on the class of the truck, scaling up each year through to 2035, and ultimately to 2045, 100% zero emission trucks in California. Just as an example, class 4 to 8, start at 9% in 2024 and scale up to 75% in 2035. And class 7 8 tractor trucks start at 5% in 2024 and scale up to 40% in 2035. So very significant development, I think landmark legislation in California. Now 15 states in the US have just signed an MOU to adopt similar type of emission reductions going forward as well. And then in China, I think you'll see over the next 30 days, the China policy being announced with the next stage of fuel cell deployment with a number of key demonstration regions with strong support. So we're seeing lots of policy support, and I think green recovery has been an important driver that we'll see likely in some other jurisdictions as well. So that's number one, is policy. Number two are the number of vehicles in the field. And so David talked a little bit about where we were at the end of the year. You just kind of think about 2 years ago, if we were having this discussion, the number of vehicles in the field was really de minimis. But today they're in the range of 32,000 plus fuel cell forklifts, 18 to 20,000 passenger cars, probably in the range of about 6,000 commercial trucks and buses operating in the field, and maybe in the range of about 400 plus fueling stations. So that's very significant. What that tells us is the technology is ready. So from a technology readiness, a reliability perspective, just as an illustrative example, at Ballard today, there are about 1,000 fuel cell buses operating with Ballard technology and about 2,200 commercial trucks. And so far in 2020, we have about a 98% fuel cell availability or uptime. So that's very good in terms of comparing that with other technologies, including legacy diesel technology. So those field deployments is a new factor that I think is providing more comfort to industry participants that we have technology readiness. The third, and I think this is perhaps the most important, and David alluded to this, is the increasing recognition of the value proposition that fuel cells deliver, particularly for medium and heavy-duty motive applications. And here we typically talk about bus, commercial truck, rail, and marine. And there are three key reasons why. The first is you're talking about applications that typically have heavy payload, a need for long range, and a need for fast refueling. And fuel cells, uniquely in my mind, address zero emission mobility for those type of use cases. The second is that these are typically use cases where you can return to base and instead of diesel refuel, hydrogen refuel. So unlike the passenger car market, you don't necessarily have to have a distributed refueling infrastructure. So centralized depot refueling, where you get high utilization of those assets with a large fleet, means lower costs and improved efficiency. And the third point, and this is one that was really important to me, is these are typically applications or use cases that disproportionately contribute to emissions. So as an illustrative example, in the US, 10% of all on-road vehicles are commercial trucks and buses, but they disproportionately contribute about 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions and a whopping 50 to 70% of NOx and PM 2.5 for mobility. So that recognition of the value proposition of fuel cells and hydrogen in heavy-duty motive applications is relatively new. And tied to that, we've seen this year for the first time, I think, credible industry reports indicating that the total cost of ownership in these applications will be compelling. So we saw a joint report from Deloitte and Ballard on this. We saw a report from McKinsey for the Hydrogen Council showing a total cost of ownership, whether it's 5 or 10 years out, depending on the different use cases, depending on the report, showing that fuel cell technology will not only be competitive against battery electric in many of these applications with improved performance, but also cost competitive with incumbent legacy internal combustion engine technology. The fourth, and David alluded to this one as well, is the growing investment that's now being made by the corporates. And we've seen that not just on the fuel cell side, and David mentioned quite a few of them in terms of Weichai and Bosch and Cummins and Michelin, Faurecia, more recently Daimler Truck and Volvo, but a lot of investment now on the electrolysis side as well. So you've got Air Liquide and Linde as illustrative examples, ThyssenKrupp, as David mentioned, making bigger investments in electrolysis. So the corporates are coming in, and that's a real indication that we're going to see not hundreds of millions, but now billions of dollars in investment to scale the industry, improve the supply chain, and drive down the cost. And the fifth one, David alluded to this as well, but I think it's really been underappreciated, and I've seen this firsthand, just as an illustrative example. in the last 6 weeks, I've had more meetings with the investment community than in the prior 6 years. And so what we're seeing is this ESG investment phenomenon is becoming compelling. And I think that's going to translate not just investments in publicly traded companies and private investments as well, but project investment. So we've seen it in the solar industry and the wind industry, where you move from early stage capital coming in the industries and supporting project finance. But I think you're going to see project and structured finance with deeper pools of capital 3 and 5 years from now, similarly to what we've seen in the solar industry. So those are the 5 trends that we see that are really shaping and accelerating what's happening in the industry. In terms of scaling up, in my mind, there's really 2 key requirements to kind of get to that tipping point like we've seen in solar and wind. We need to continue to have, for a period of time, policy support, and potentially, if we saw the real value of carbon emissions being monetized in some type of carbon tax or carbon policy, that would really facilitate, a tipping point. But in my mind, it's really about getting the cost of green hydrogen reduced, and now seeing gigawatts rather than hundreds of kilowatts or megawatts, but gigawatts of electrolyzers. We're seeing in terms of sales pipelines and opportunities, and the EU announcing, getting to that 40 gigawatt range in the 2025-2030 timeframe. This is really going to enable massive cost reduction on the electrolyzer side. So green hydrogen is critically important. On the fuel cell side, it's the top 3 priorities there: cost reduction, cost reduction, cost reduction. And certainly at Ballard, just to give you as an illustrative example, I think what you can expect from the industry, we have a roadmap right now that is fairly well baked, not a lot of risk, technology risk at this stage, with a 70% cost reduction in our fuel cell stacks, based on improved continued development, supply chain activities, and volume assumptions that are tied to our business plan. We're not talking about massive volume assumptions. So we're pretty excited about what we see in terms of cost reduction. We'll see some cost reduction occurring in storage. And as we have new suppliers, particularly these tier 1 suppliers in automotive that David alluded to, coming to the supply chain, that are experts in supply chain, are experts in walking costs down annually, incrementally, we're going to see a massive shift on the cost side to enable that TCO for fuel cell applications and hydrogen to be competitive.
Sure. Thanks, Randy. And it's great to have those insights today, and especially as it's so early in the morning where you are. Viewers, Randy's in Vancouver. So thanks for joining us very early. You kind of preempted my next question, which was alluding to, what we've seen unfold this year. I wanted to ask, have you seen any of this progress dampened or blunted by the effects of COVID-19? It sounds like maybe you haven't.
Yeah, so I think the 2 key things that I would point out are actually accelerants, not indicators that, there are delays, I would say, in some order intake, whether it's on the electrolyzer business or the fuel cell industry. I've seen that occurring. But more importantly to me, 2 key developments. One is this, now understood linkage between long-term exposure to PM 2.5 and COVID mortality rates. And so I think it's just another reason for us to eliminate, PM 2.5. And the second one, I think that's critically important is, I think online e-commerce has probably been accelerated by 2 years as a result of COVID-19. It was very high already in some of the Asian markets, but it's really become more advanced in North America and Europe as a result of COVID-19. We've always viewed that by 2050, you're likely to see a 40% increase in logistics and trucking as a result of online e-commerce. This is at the same time we're trying to address greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions as well. So decarbonizing heavy-duty mobility is going to be critically important. So I think the expected trend in logistics and trucking is only accelerated in my mind. Probably the last point, of course, is that a lot of these green stimulus packages want to tie it to, sustainability. So overall, I would say it's actually been a surprising catalyst for, continued investment longer term in hydrogen and fuel cells.
Okay, great. Well, that's clearly a better answer to hear than we might have expected. Thank you, Randy. Now, for anyone watching part one of this series last week, you'll know that compression technologies became a bit of a running theme throughout the webinar, referenced by both our panel and our audience with their questions. There seem to be a lot of question marks over the compression technologies available, the practicalities of those, and just like electrolyzers, these are seen as a really fundamental part of cracking this value chain. So we decided to revisit this topic right here, right now. Compression wasn't originally on our agenda for the webinar today, but we couldn't let this hot topic pass without tackling it, and we invited PDC Machines to come and share some of its insights into the field of compression technologies. The company's been designing and manufacturing diaphragm compressors for decades for ultra-high purity compression of the widest possible range of gases and mixtures, and it's increasingly at the heart of the hydrogen space too, with its diaphragm compressors integral to many hydrogen refueling stations. So let's get into it and talk about all things compression with Jim Petrecki, Director of Hydrogen Energy for North America, Europe and Oceania. Jim, thanks for joining us today. Tell us about some of the references or case studies that PDC has in hydrogen.
No problem, Rob. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for asking me to participate and talk about scaling compression. It's a very important topic because the size of hydrogen projects continues to grow from several tons per day to even several tens of tons per day. And compression is needed to make the hydrogen useful in the applications that has been discussed so far. So you asked me for a couple of case studies. The first is our latest HRS solution, which is currently being installed in Canberra in the Australian Capital Territory. This station, which is the first of its kind in Australia, will fuel a fleet of 20 Hyundai Nexo vehicles. The station takes hydrogen from a 30-bar electrolyzer and provides T40 fast fills at 700 bar. I bring up this specific case because compression can scale in an existing station with future proofing. That is, the station is designed to grow with the vehicle fleet with minimal impact to the HRS. The site capacity will triple next year by adding the compressor inside the existing enclosure without changing the station footprint. So having an idea of where you want to go in the future, the sites are capable of growing in compression capacity with minimal investment. A second study is the use of PDC compressors in several North American bus stations. In a similar way to the Australian site, our compression is taking on-site or delivered hydrogen and boosting it to 500 bar to cascade fill into buses. With a single two-stage diaphragm compressor, we can boost about a ton of hydrogen per day. Alternatively, we can use a four-stage machine that can handle 2 tons per day in a single machine. Buses typically consume about 30 kilograms per day. So one of these compressors can fill 30 to 60 buses per day. And as more buses are converted to fuel cells and longer routes are deployed, we expect the required capacity of those compressors will grow.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And where do you see the challenges ahead? Is there a gap to be met in compression technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a gap in compression capacity that's available today and the requirements that we see for the future. Those two cases that I brought up center on 100 kilograms a day and 1,000 kilograms a day, but we're quoting solutions for several tons per day. And these sizes are mainly driven from power to gas applications for transportation and decarbonizing natural gas. Companies like Hyundai and Toyota and Nikola are all building trucks that will consume 100 kilograms per day each. So a fleet of trucks will use an immense amount of hydrogen. So Rob, the question is, how do we scale compression to meet these needs? And I've got 4 answers for you. First, in the near term, the answer is running compressors in parallel. For example, for a 10 megawatt power to gas to mobile pipeline station, we can run 3 two-stage compressors in parallel to achieve 4.5 tons per day that's required. That's a solution right now that optimizes CapEx and provides inherent redundancy. The second answer is to use compressors to direct fill vehicles in high capacity applications. So why does this matter? Because cascade fills require boosting the hydrogen to pressures that are higher than the vehicle pressure. So for a 700 bar fill, we compress to 900 or 950 ground storage, 950 bar ground storage. But there's a trade-off, right? So compressing to a higher pressure reduces the flow capacity. Not to mention it requires a lot of ground storage to hold the high pressure hydrogen. So instead of doing cascade fills for large capacity stations, we can look at direct filling to the vehicle. And because of that, we can reduce the compression ratio and get more flow through the compressor and simplify the station design. The third answer is to take a really close look at a holistic view of the station design. And I'm cheating here a bit, I know. It's not addressing how much flow the compressor can do, but how the compressor is being used. The choice of the hydrogen source has an incredible impact on the compressor capacity. So we recommend using pressurized alkaline electrolyzers with 7 or 8 bar discharge, or PEM electrolyzers because they have a starting point at 30 bar. So an example here, 30 bar to 300 bar, that's a 10-to-1 ratio. And we can get this done with a simple 2-stage machine. 30 bar up to 700 bar is a compression ratio of 23-to-1. That's a simple 3-stage machine. All this is very doable. You have high compression flow rates, no problem. On the other hand, atmospheric electrolyzers have an output of about 60 millibar, which is 0.6 bar. So if you go from 0.6 bar up to 300 bar, that's a compression ratio of 500-to-1. And going from 0.6 bar up to 700 bar is almost 1200-to-1. So those are incredible numbers, and that's a lot of compression stages to get it done. So as a result, the complexity of the compressor skyrockets. So I urge you to think about the site holistically to optimize the different pieces working together. So let me summarize. The first answer was to run the currently available compressors together to meet the required flow. The second answer was to change how you're fueling vehicles to limit the compression ratio and gain flow. The third answer was to ensure a reasonable supply pressure, but I haven't addressed the compressor technology itself yet. So the fourth answer is to look at the compressor as a black box and determine how to scale it from 1 to 2 tons per day that we have now up to 10 to 20 tons per day in a single machine. And that's what PDC is looking at right now. We are developing an architecture that uses the compressor heads that have been hardened over the past 40 years, that are being used in over 4,000 machines in the field, and change the way that we operate to enable an order of magnitude change in flow rates. We recognize that the throughput of these stations will continue to grow in the future, and compression technology requires an elegant solution with smaller CapEx, smaller footprint, reduced maintenance, inherent redundancy, and maximum uptime. So PDC will have more information on a very high capacity diaphragm compressor solution in the early part of next year. There's more to come on that. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Jim. There's certainly some huge demands on the compression side there. A lot of scale up required. Just one more question from me, if we can, before we move on. Are there any particular hurdles or geographical challenges? Any barriers to be overcome there?
Geography really isn't a big deal at all. I mean, we're putting compressors on 6 continents right now. Like I said, we just got into Australia, so that's a burgeoning market, and there's going to be great opportunities there. You know, the differences are certification, right? So Europe requires CE with PED and ATEX machinery. Australia is going to use their electrical standards in IEC EX. North America has NFPA and NEC. So you know, there's some slight changes that are required in terms of certification. You know, but what we do is have factory certification. So we will use a third party that comes in, that works with us throughout the entire project We identify the requirements right at the start. We build the compressor to the requirements. We had them come back in, go through the design, go through the operation, work with us with the factory acceptance test, and then they put their certification stamp right on the compressor before it leaves the factory. So when it gets to the site, it's ready to go. Permitting is very easy. And so, yeah, I think geography is not really an issue. It's just let's make sure that we understand what certification requirements are necessary at the beginning of the project.
Great, thanks, Jim. Okay, well, it's that time again for us all. The floor is open to Q&A shortly. So join us in just a few seconds after this short message from H2View.
Thank you for joining the webinar today. Did you know that you can catch up on all of the webinars by simply visiting Gasworld TV and selecting Watch on Demand? Most recently, H2View's Rob Cockrell sits down in conversation with Oliver Bishop from Shell Hydrogen. Catch up on the exclusive at Gasworld TV today.
Welcome back. I can see we've got a few questions coming into our room already, so let's get stuck into them. I think we're going to start with a question from Luca, and I believe we'll put this one to you first, David, if we can. Luca says, great to hear about the hydrogen market growing so fast, very exciting. What about the water needed to feed the electrolyzers? Are there any comments here about sourcing, availability, and its cost?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a difficult one to answer very generically because it's obviously very location dependent. So there is clearly at least a potential issue if you're looking to use a lot of water in arid regions, and that conflicts very slightly with the fact that very often the arid regions have pretty good solar insulation and potentially even a lot of wind. That said, there are two aspects we do need to consider. One is that it is a closed loop, so the water that you use to produce hydrogen is then recombined with oxygen from the air and turned back into water. Of course, that may be in a different place. If you're shipping hydrogen around, then you don't have a localized closed loop. The second is that increasingly people are looking at desalination technologies as part of this. And one way of doing that is conventional desalination in an arid area. Middle East, North Africa already have a lot of these technologies in place. They do take quite a lot of energy, but they very often can run also on renewables. So it depends on the type of desalination technology, but it gives a further opportunity. The other thing is that people are also looking at possibly the electrolysis directly of seawater. Now that's a bit more challenging. It requires slightly different materials and components. It has some other issues that need to be faced, but it's not impossible by any means. So the water question is one that needs to be asked, and it needs to be answered locally. But it's not a showstopper by any means. But it is an important part of the overall question. The only other thing I'd just add, and this is a little bit, it's certainly not tangential, but the whole life cycle analysis question, where do the resources come from? How are they produced? What's the rest of the usage chain? How do you recycle? How do you reuse? Is very much front and center. And that's been brought to a certain amount of a head because of questions about battery supply chains, and not only the resource availability and the location in the world, but also the social aspects of, for example, mining some of these metals in different places. But also it's part of the ESG drive that I was talking about earlier. So companies want to know end to end whether what they're doing is a good thing. And the politicians, of course, are trying to look at sustainable solutions as well. So from a bigger picture perspective, the water will be important, and it's always going to be a trade-off against all of these very complicated factors. But the research that we've done, the research that I've seen published, suggests that the water is not, as I say, a critical showstopper, at least in most areas.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. I'm going to put the next question to both Jim and Randy. We'll start with you first, Jim. Rick has asked, do you think the US is doing enough to develop green hydrogen, and do you see a clear future for it there? Or is the US falling behind compared to the investments and developments in the EU and the rest of the world?
It's a good question, and I think that I wish that the United States was taking more of a lead on green hydrogen here. I do feel that we're falling behind other parts of the world. There's very significant investment that's going on in Europe, and Australia, but hopefully some of the news that had come out in the last 3 months or so will show that the tide is turning on that. There is discussions about very large power to gas stations that will be developed in the next 2 to 3 to 4 years in the United States. So I think you're going to start to see some change there.
Okay, and perhaps over to you, Randy, for any comment on that.
Yeah, I think Rick is asking a question with a potential landmine. But what I would say is a couple things. One is that in the U.S., California is really very focused on, addressing emissions, addressing greenhouse gas. There are a number of other issues tied to this in California. Forest fires, as an illustrative example, have really been a challenge there. So I think the question that Rick asked is the question the U.S. is asking itself now as well, because the U.S. and even Canada, to a lesser extent, have had significant historic investment in the hydrogen and fuel cell industry. So there's a lot of sunk investment that they're really at risk of losing leadership position in a number of areas in the hydrogen and fuel cell value chain. And so I think the U.S. is now asking themselves that question with the announcements they're seeing globally, particularly in the EU. What do we need to do in order to preserve that sunk investment and leverage it going forward? I think we're likely going to need some type of national leadership at the U.S. front on this issue.
Okay, great. Thank you. David, we're going to come back to you for a couple of questions here, slightly regional again. Nigel Holmes asks, David, you mentioned the inquiries from venture capitalists and investment banks looking for climate-friendly projects. What are the key factors in making investment decisions? Do policies such as the EU Sustainable Investment Taxonomy and consideration on carbon border pricing have a growing influence on scale and locations for investments?
Yes, they do, inevitably. So there is enthusiasm, and maybe let me broaden this slightly. As Randy also said, I think we're going to see increasing interest in project investment, which is partly speaking to Nigel's question, and that of course does depend strongly on things like cross-border carbon treatment and other aspects. What I was alluding to, and apologies if this doesn't answer your question directly, Nigel, is actually that the big investors, so the pension funds and others, are not only looking at projects and looking at hydrogen-friendly investments, but they are looking at companies and putting pressure on boards and shareholders or as part of shareholder groups from this ESG perspective. And the important thing there is that, let's say 2 years ago, if a big company, let's a Shell or an Exxon or whoever it is, had presented at their shareholder meeting, we're going to do hydrogen, then all of the big investors would have said, whoa, risk, sorry, not sure about that, where is that going? And they would have marked them down for it. Now there is active pressure on the boards to say, well, why aren't you doing hydrogen? So it's a really interesting shift, and it has a knock-on influence which clearly changes the corporate perspective. And as Randy says, it creates also an investment opportunity within the corporates to put money into the supply chain because they realize they won't get penalized. So that's the thing that I think is particularly interesting and particularly positive, is that you now have the heavyweights of the finance world sending positive signals for companies who are looking at fuel cells and hydrogen and actually making investments.
Okay, and the second question, David, in terms of the pathway or the technology, Farid asks us, in terms of green hydrogen production from sources, biomass and water are renewable candidates, but on the other hand, hydrogen can be produced via power to gas technology where renewable electricity is available. Which pathway has more chance to meet the economical targets in the future?
So this one, like Randy was saying, this one also can be a minefield. And a couple of comments. One, we were part of that McKinsey study. We were helping on the Hydrogen Council cost analysis for all of those different pathways. And there are two things that are important. One is that if we are going to meet net zero climate targets, we will need all of the above in the near term and potentially in the longer term as well. So there will be a regional specialization, I think. In some places, green hydrogen will absolutely be the obvious winner. In some places, and we've even seen today a little bit of trailing of the fact that Canada may be introducing a sort of blue hydrogen strategy. We will see potentially fossil-based hydrogen, but with carbon capture and use or sequestration or solid carbon production from pyrolysis or other mechanisms. So the economics of hydrogen value chains are very region specific, because also it depends on how much you need and how far you have to transport it. And so my view is very much technology agnostic. If it's low emissions, and if it meets cost targets, then it will definitely play a role. And I think we will see both large-scale green hydrogen and large-scale blue hydrogen and some other unusual technologies, which may be microbial production or direct photoelectrochemical production or all sorts of other things. And power to gas simply fits as part of that rather complicated but interesting picture.
Okay, thanks for attempting to avoid all those landmines there, David. To Jim, we've got a few questions coming in, as we might well have predicted. You know, we said compression was a big theme last week. It is again here today. Rakesh has a question for you, Jim, which is, in fuel cell vehicles, which type of compressors are used? And equally, what type of compressors are used for filling hydrogen in vehicles?
Well, it really depends on if you're filling with direct filling, like I was mentioning, as one of the opportunities for high capacity, or if you're doing cascade fills, right? So we have a product family that goes from PDC 3s, which are about 50 kilograms a day, all the way up to PDC 13s that are 1,000 or 2,000 kilograms a day. So it really depends on the specific application. But for small car filling stations, we typically will do the cascade fill system. So we'll go up from something like 30 to 900 bar and concentrate on that. Where there's high capacity stations for heavy duty or medium duty buses, we will concentrate on the PDC 13s that offer a lot more flow. There's a lower compression ratio allowable for the higher capacity machines. However, those are the ones that are most economically viable for the larger capacity stations. So, I invite you to give me the process conditions, and I can customize a solution for you.
Thanks, Jim. And a question from Rodrigo, which is fairly technical in nature. Again, for you, Jim. What about the environmental effects on compressors, such as altitude and temperature? Do they have any impact?
Temperature, absolutely. Temperature is going to have an effect on the discharge temperature of each stage. So this is getting a little technical here, but if you have a higher ambient temperature, that means that the allowable compression ratio for each of the stages is going to be somewhat limited, because you're not able to reject the heat into the environment from the heat of combustion, right? Unless you use a chiller. But chillers add a lot of expense to the compression set, and so we try to stay away from that. If we're going to a hot location like Saudi Arabia or Australia, the allowable flow rate for those compressors is going to be somewhat limited, because we don't want to exceed the temperature limitations of the soft parts in the heads, specifically the O-rings and seals around check valves, and to prevent overboard leaks of the heads. So there is going to be some limitation. I don't think it's a very large limitation to the flow rate, but it could be something like 10%. Altitude has less of an impact. It's negligible and not even worth discussing.
Okay, thanks there, Jim. We'll give you a break for a second before I'm sure we come back to compression. Randy, if we can turn to you for a moment. Kai Leung has a question for you, which is, Ballard is active in the Chinese market. Can you tell us about the scale of FCEVs compared with in Europe and the US? Is that something you can discuss?
Yeah, so Kai Young, I think China has really, over the last 24 months, eclipsed the other markets in terms of actual field deployments for heavy-duty motor vehicles. So I mentioned earlier, for example, Ballard has about 2,200 commercial trucks and about 1,000 buses in operation globally. Most of those are in China. We have a pretty good deployment of fuel cell buses in Europe and a smaller deployment in the US, but primarily the trucks are based in China right now. And I think what we're probably looking at is China focusing on 1,000 fuel cell electric vehicles by 2030, sorry, 1 million by 2030. And we're likely to see most of those to be commercial trucks, a variety of different kinds of trucks, different weight classes, as well as buses. So I think you'll see that's where the growth is going to occur in that market.
Okay, thanks, Randy. We're going to move away from some technical questions for a moment to some more overarching discussion. We have a question here from, where did this one come from? I think it was Tim Dominil, who asked our panel, the speakers covered the generation of hydrogen and the end use of hydrogen. What about the route to market? For example, how do we get large-scale hydrogen from the point of generation to the end user? Hydrogen by pipeline and shipping as ammonia were both mentioned. Will compressor innovation play a role? Who would like to say that one first?
I'm happy to give my perspective if that's useful. So I think we're in a really interesting moment, as I was saying, which is the inflection point. And what I think is particularly important right now is actually quite a lot of co-location. So at the moment we have a small hydrogen generation industry, to be completely honest, whether it's blue or green, and we have relatively small demand. But we have a lot of interest from industrial applications and from others, and those are some of the ones which will scale quickly enough to make it meaningful, both for these big companies, but also to bring the cost down. And so I think what we're looking at in the near term is actually quite short pathways in places where it makes sense. And one of the examples would be the NEOM announcement in Saudi Arabia, where you use solar to produce hydrogen and then you immediately make it into ammonia at a very large scale, and then you ship the ammonia. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is, as we understand the economics and as we start to build these clusters, we will also understand the best ways to ship. And I think, again, that there will be some level of technology agnosticism. So we will have pipelines, we will have liquid organic hydrogen carriers under some circumstances, we'll have ammonia, we'll have compressed, but it will be very much dependent on local conditions again, because the economics are very different for those different solutions at different scales and at different distances.
Thanks, David. I don't know if you, Jim or Randy, would have anything to add.
Yeah, I'll make a couple comments. If you look at the Hydrogen Council report again, prepared by McKinsey, I think the way to think about production and then I'll call it transport of hydrogen, about 50% of the cost relates to the generation of hydrogen. About 50% of the cost relates to getting it from that centralized generation point, typically to where it's used and actually to the vehicle in mobility applications. And so when you look at kind of $4 to $5 US per kilogram of hydrogen, you're able to cost competitively address 50% of the global mobility energy market. And I think what was interesting is that where you have lower cost generation, you typically have slightly higher cost of transporting it. And conversely, where you have higher cost production, you typically have lower cost of transporting it. But one of the things that I think is really compelling is the opportunity to use natural gas pipelines. And, there's potentially significant stranded assets. You look at a company like Infrastructure Assets out of Hong Kong that has pipeline infrastructure in Australia, in the UK, in Hong Kong, that are looking at 20% of hydrogen going into that pipeline infrastructure to be able to use that, so you don't end up in a situation 30, 40 years from now where those assets are effectively need to be written off and are stranded. So I think there's lots of opportunity to transport it in different formats. It'll be very specific to jurisdiction. Pipeline is certainly one alternative that I think is probably underappreciated in my mind right now. And then in large quantities, shipping it as ammonia is a very good option. And just to punctuate one point is that when you look at the use cases and the ability, we'll call it multimodal applications, getting high use, so high demand and then high use of your assets, high utilization really drives the cost down. So, even if you look at the mobility applications, having 100 buses or a couple hundred commercial trucks that have high utilization on the hydrogen refueling infrastructure assets really helps drive the cost down. So I think it's going to be a function of not just low cost production, which was talked about earlier, but picking the best transportation methodology depending on where you're located, and then getting high utilization as well.
Yeah, I think both panelists really hit it on the head. When we look at the dollar per kilogram for hydrogen stations, if we can cluster a bunch of applications together, whether it's heavy duty trucking and medium duty buses and forklift trucks and passenger vehicles that are all pulling off of the same infrastructure, you're going to get a lot of volume through that station, and you're going to amortize that capital over many, many molecules, many tons of kilograms. So I think that's really important. When you look at how the price of hydrogen stations grows with volume, it starts out very high and then it tends to kind of fall over. Whereas that's the exact opposite of what you would see with batteries, right? So it's easy to have the first battery electric vehicle, right? You just put a charger, you charge your vehicle, you're all done. If you go up to 10 battery electric vehicles, it gets a little more complicated. Then when you get to 100, now you might have to start talking about the substation down the road. And 1,000 and 10,000, it starts to become, you have to plan the entire city around it. Whereas if you looked at that same type of scaling with hydrogen, you're growing the hydrogen station, but it's not going exponential. It's actually going the opposite way. So the next incremental vehicle that needs to be serviced by that hydrogen station is actually lower and lower as you go on. So I think that clustering a lot of different applications together to get that density of hydrogen usage is the real way to go.
Great, thank you.
Jim brought an important point there. I would just, I think it's Exhibit 22 in that Hydrogen Council report that really punctuates this point about the scaling leverage you get from hydrogen compared to the challenge you have with battery recharging.
Great, thanks for that addendum there, Andy. Now we've got so many questions coming in. In the interest of brevity for us all, I'm going to try and funnel this down to the final two or three. If we come back to you for a moment, Jim. Rita Rodriguez asks, you've mentioned direct filling in order to reduce the number of steps in the process. Can you expand on how it would work in practical terms? Do you compress and store at lower pressure, or do you produce on demand? If the latter, how do you deal with the rush hour in base stations?
Yeah, so typically what you would do is, this is a high capacity station. So this is a station that's going to have a nice level throughput, or it will have some sort of a recognizable load profile. And the great thing about electrolyzers is you can ramp up and ramp down. And what we'll use is a buffer vessel in between the electrolyzer and the compressor. So if the electrolyzer is putting out, let's say, 5 tons a day, and the compressor is sized for 5 tons a day, if the demand of the station drops down, the electrolyzer can drop down, and the discharge pressure will continue, but the buffer storage pressure will decrease. and the compressor has a flow curve that drops with suction pressure, right? So it basically finds a mass balance with the electrolyzer. And so the two of them actually can float together with the demand from the station. So yeah, we use a buffer vessel as the way to help not only connect the two of them together, but allow the compressor to move with the electrolyzer. And so then we would just have multiple dispensers that come from the compressors, and we can fuel a lot of vehicles simultaneously.
Great, thank you. And staying on a kind of pressure point of view and also a regional perspective, we have a question here that says, in South Korea, both fuel cell buses and commercial vehicles use the same hydrogen refueling station, as both vehicles have 700 bar pressure hydrogen tank. Is it the same in Europe and the US, or are there separate refueling stations?
It's a mismatch of solutions, right? So a lot of the buses around the world are at 350 bar. A lot of the passenger vehicles are at 700 bar. Now, the reason why that is because cars need to have the same type of range as a internal combustion engine car in order to have the same experience, right? So the whole thing about hydrogen vehicles is that there's no compromise going from a gasoline vehicle to a hydrogen vehicle. So we want to make sure that it has the same fueling rate and the same range. And the car doesn't have a lot of space. So we have to compress it up to 700 bars so that we can get the density of fuel so that we can provide a similar value proposition to what's currently out there. For buses, they don't have that problem, right? They add very large storage on the top of the bus, on the roof. And so you can get away with using 350 bar because there's a lot more real estate on the bus. And Randy can probably talk to this a bit more better than I can. But 350 bar hydrogen is going to be cheaper than 700 bar hydrogen because of less compression requirements, and the storage and the actuators and piping and the rest of the station is going to be cheaper because of lower pressure requirements. So that's the reason why there's two different pressures, but a lot of different geographies are taking different approaches at this. As you said, South Korea has some 700 bar medium and heavy duty applications. Nikola here in the United States is looking at 700 bar, and it's for that same thing, to get the maximum amount of range for their heavy duty applications. So it's not an easy answer to the question, but those are the inputs to the decision making process.
Sure. And Randy, Jim said you might be able to add to that. Would you care to offer anything?
I think Jim's done a great job answering it, actually, but I do think a lot of fueling stations, increasingly, you may see both options available. Yep. But typically the type of fueling stations we see in the medium and heavy duty motive applications are focused on a particular fleet of vehicles. So that fleet will typically have all the same type of pressurized storage, typically 350 bar. But I think as we increasingly move into other commercial vehicle applications where range is critically important and the packaging considerations on the vehicle on board are tight, you'll see higher pressures.
Okay, great. As I said, we have so many questions. I thought we might try and conclude here with a couple of questions and a bit of a speed response round. Perhaps that'll be the best way of getting around for all of our panelists. First up, if we can try and answer this in a one-liner, perhaps. Panchali asks, do you think hydrogen energy can be a sudden game changer in a post-pandemic scenario world? We'll start with you, David.
One-liner, yes. That's a very big question. I think refer to my original intro in terms of post-COVID recovery, green deals, all of those sort of things. I think hydrogen has a very big role to play.
Sure. To you, Randy?
Yeah, nothing more to add. I mean, it's a catalyst in my mind. COVID-19 has been a catalyst, and we're going to see very significant adoption between 2025 and 2030 in a number of applications.
Sure. And you, Jim?
Yeah, same thing. I'm echoing the other panelists. The answer is yes, but but also when we start to look at the capital expenditures that are sunk costs and we eliminate them, then comparing hydrogen stations and equipment becomes a little easier. The issue with hydrogen has been there's all of these investments that have been made over many, many years. When those start to become not as usable, and we can look at hydrogen on a one-to-one basis with gasoline and diesel and other equipment, then it becomes an easier conversation.
Sure. And the concluding question, because I think it ties in very well with our theme today and perhaps some of the overarching discussion we've had. This one comes from Harry DeRose. What do you think the largest barrier to creating green hydrogen at scale is? Or is it a combination of things? If we go again, we'll start with you, David.
To be completely honest, I'm really very positive that there are no intrinsic barriers. What we see is we've seen huge amounts of renewable capacity go in and costs come down very, very low. We are seeing the electrolyzer industry scaling up. We're seeing the demand side also. So I think honestly the only thing that's slowing us down is moving through that transition to scale. I think green hydrogen will be demonstrably competitive in certain regions of the world in the next 2, 3, 4 years. And then, as Randy said, from 2025, things will really take off. So honestly, there are no fundamental barriers. It's just about making sure that we can get the equipment into the production lines and then onto the ground.
Okay, and Randy, any concluding comments from you?
Yeah, I agree. There are no fundamental barriers. A year ago, I would have said policy clarity would have been a fundamental barrier, but we've been very encouraged, obviously, with what we've seen coming out of Europe, and I think we'll see longer term, more positive signal from a policy front in China and in the North American market as well to support the scaling up of electrolysis and cost reduction of electrolysis. But from a technology perspective, I think we've been blessed with low cost renewables, and the cost of renewables are continuing to come down. It's not unfathomable to think about sub 1 cent wind and solar, a decade from now.
Sure. And finally to you, Jim.
Yeah, I think the biggest barrier is political will. As Randy said, the cost of renewables is coming down, and I think we're below both for solar and wind. I think we're below $40 per megawatt hour right now. So if you're using electrolyzers that are readily available right now, that's less than $2.50 per kilogram, which is an equivalent of about $5 per gallon of diesel. So and growing those renewable stations to be larger and larger, we can get the price per kilogram down for hydrogen. So we just really need to be investing as states, as countries, as the world, investing into clean energy, because it's available, it's cheap, and we can be making very, very cheap green hydrogen from it.
Absolutely, and thanks. What a great Q&A session. If your question wasn't asked, then we will do our very best to facilitate that question through to the panel and ensure you get those responses and perhaps some connections along the way. And that concludes our webinar today. Thanks once more to all of our panelists, that's David and Randy and Jim, for your participation across various time zones and sharing those insights with us all. Clearly, we have our work cut out to drive forward this significant scale up that we need. But there are also such very clear signals, as Randy himself has said, and as we've heard today, of the progress being made even as we sit here in this hour. We'll pick up the baton again next week when we speak with some of the hydrogen converts and enthusiasts along the way who are going to talk to us about being the change we wish to see, from buses to aviation and even green refineries. We hope to see you again then. Until then, thanks for your time and goodbye.